A newer trend that we saw in the 2020 election and already in the 2022 midterms is that disinformation is being heavily targeted at Spanish-speaking voters, sparking and fueling conspiracy theories. DHS and its components play a big role in addressing mis- and disinformation in Spanish and other languages. Can you share what steps you've taken and what future plans you have to address Spanish language mis- and disinformation through department-wide approach?
Our Undersecretary for Policy, Rob Silvers, is co-chair with our Principal Deputy General Counsel, Jennifer Daskell, in leading a just recently constituted misinformation, disinformation governance board. So we're bringing, the goal is to bring the resources of the department together to address this threat. Be pleased
But
to share
Mr. Secretary, what I've heard you describe are internal organizations. What we are looking for is to make sure that there's external communications with the American public, including those for whom Spanish is their predominant language, to make sure that the information that the department has around mis- and disinformation campaigns is reaching those. Another huge threat to our homeland is mis- and disinformation. You noted that it's a concern of yours at the border, with human smuggling organizations peddling misinformation to exploit vulnerable migrants for profit. One of my main concerns about disinformation is that foreign adversaries attempt to destabilize our elections by targeting people of color with disinformation campaigns. After it became clear that there was foreign meddling in our 2016 election, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence authored a report on the disinformation tactics used by Russia's Internet Research Agency, the IRA, to interfere in the election. The report found that, quote, no single group of Americans was targeted by the IRA information operatives more than African Americans. A newer trend that we saw in the 2020 election and already in the 2022 midterms is that disinformation is being heavily targeted at Spanish-speaking voters, sparking and fueling conspiracy theories. DHS and its components play a big role in addressing mis- and disinformation in Spanish and other languages. Can you share what steps you've taken and what future plans you have to address Spanish language mis- and disinformation through department-wide approach?
Misinformation comes in all languages, but there's growing evidence that the misinformation crisis is most acute for one group in particular in this country, Latinos. The most recent Pew Research study found that Hispanic adults are more likely to use YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and WhatsApp, the Facebook-owned private messaging service. They use it more than white and black Americans. In fact, nearly half of Latinos are on WhatsApp, compared to just a quarter of the general population. And not only are Latinos more likely to have social media accounts, they're also spending more time on the platform than anyone else. And that brings us to the real problem. It lies in the content they're reading. The fact is, you're more likely to encounter misinformation online if you're Latino and speak Spanish than if you're white and speak English. And as Morgan Radford reports, while social media platforms like Facebook are expanding Spanish language fact-checking, the impact on the Latino community is already evident.
Susie Calderon doesn't trust the mainstream media.
I don't believe in the vaccines.
You do not believe in the vaccines?
No.
What do you believe they will do to you?
I think the vaccine has a lot of chemics, and they can damage your body in the long run.
And from where she's sitting, things are getting worse.
It's like they're taking away our rights. You can talk normally. You have a mask in your face, people see half of your face.
What are some of the things you think that the mainstream media is getting wrong?
Well, disinformation. They want us to not to talk. They don't want us to say the truth.
Susie came from Cuba in the 1980s. Her daughter, Amore Rodriguez, worries that the government propaganda her mom experienced in Cuba is coloring her perception of what factual information looks like here.
It concerns me that truth doesn't exist anymore.
Which is part of the reason she started this group.
Materials, sign-up lists, graphics.
Of like-minded Cuban Americans concerned about the information their families are getting here at home.
Do you think there is misinformation within the Latino community?
Absolutely.
Are you kidding me?
110%.
Oh my God. I mean, it's everywhere. Not only misinformation, but disinformation targeted specifically Spanish language and the Latino community.
It's a belief backed up by national research, with more than a third of Hispanic Americans saying they see misinformation often online. According to one analysis by activist group Avaz, nearly 70% of misinformation in Spanish went unlabeled by Facebook, compared to less than 30% of misinformation in English.
By a show of hands, how many of you have personally received misinformation? All of you.
Yeah.
Where did it come from?
Our tias, our primos, our abuelas.
De todos.
Everybody.
Besides COVID, what else are you seeing? What other types of misinformation is out there?
I've seen misinformation on the election. Democrats stole the election. You know, Antifa was the one that stormed the Capitol on January 6th.
Did it work?
Absolutely.
We didn't just see it in the Cuban community, which we represent, but we saw it in the Venezolano community, in the Nicaraguense community.
And it works because the trauma is real, right? The misinformation is fake, but the trauma is very real. And I think what it is if anything, it makes it so sad to see our family's trauma be exploited.
When your family shares this type of misinformation with you, what do you say?
I personally hit back immediately. I review it. I make sure I fact check myself.
We're literally living in two different realities.
I came home one day and my sister was like, "Girl, did you hear?" I was like, "What happened?" She said, "Hillary Clinton's dead." And I was like, "What?" So I picked up my phone. I was on Twitter. I was trying to find it. And I was like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Yeah, they killed her in Guantanamo." And I'm like, "Why?" She's like, "Because she's kidnapping Haitian kids and all this stuff." And I was like, "Who told you this?" She's like, "Abuela." And I'm like,
so your sister told you your grandma said this?
yes.
And it's a phenomenon that's having real-world effects. In Florida, 40% of Cuban Americans say they don't believe President Joe Biden was legitimately elected. And given that Latinos spend more time on social media than their non-Hispanic white counterparts, it's a problem that's not going away. But it's not just happening in Florida. In Texas, Democratic strategists are sounding the alarm about a wave of misinformation aimed at Latinos heading into 2022.
Vote red!
Information Tony Torres receives firsthand.
Can you show me where you get your information on?
Yeah, like, okay.
This is Telegram, Alex Jones, Proud Boys.
These are just different news sources.
Torres is a Latino voter in the Rio Grande Valley who wears a shirt to show he opposes President Biden, which saw one of the biggest rightward shifts in the country from 2016 to 2020. He says the information he receives online directly impacts how he votes, especially with so much competing information about the pandemic.
I've never been tested. I've never been vaccinated. I'm not afraid of it.
So you've never been tested?
I've never been tested. I'll never get tested.
Why?
Because I don't want that thing down my nose, because I heard now that they're taking your DNA.
Do you believe it? Wait, you heard they're taking your DNA
Yes.
when they swipe you for COVID tests?
Yes.
I have never heard that.
Yeah.
Where did you hear that?
I heard that from Alex Jones.
An epidemic of misinformation that some are tracking in real time.
Here's one, for example, claiming the vaccine has a microchip, still up, no label. It's all in Spanish.
Jacobo Licona is a misinformation researcher at X Labs. His job to track down and flag some of the biggest pieces of Spanish language misinformation making the rounds online.
It's a big problem because what we see is that the Latino community specifically, when it comes to Spanish language disinformation, is consuming information from both hemispheres. During the November 2020 election, for example, there was a lot of voter fraud narrative spreading, false information. The English content was being labeled or getting removed or having a fact check, while the Spanish content either was taking days to get labeled or never getting labeled at all.
But where is it coming from? According to a Washington Post analysis, much of the misinformation spread uncontested or was even outright weaponized by those opposed to Joe Biden. Other sources include some Spanish language media, private WhatsApp channels, and other social media. A problem, he says, social media companies like Facebook have failed to fix.
Given that what they said and showing concerns about the 2020 election, showing concerns about what was spreading around the pandemic and vaccines, it's clear that they have research looking into it, but aren't taking the appropriate actions after that.
But not all misinformation comes through social media. For example, for many Latino voters, like here in South Florida, it comes through a much more old-fashioned way, like through the airwaves
of their AM radio. Julio Ligorria and Juan Camilo Gomez host a radio show at Actualidad 1040 AM.
Is there a lot of misinformation within the Latino community here?
Yes.
That much, huh?
Yes.
One of the top AM Spanish language stations in South Florida, the station and its top competitor, Radio Mambi, reaching nearly 300,000 daily listeners combined, both of which were the subjects of a new study done by a mix of nonpartisan and progressive groups in South Florida, accusing them of spreading misinformation and disinformation to Florida's Latino community. Among the examples, that 42,000 people in Nevada voted more than once, and that Black Lives Matter members took part in the January 6th attacks. It's the type of misinformation that Ligorria and Gomez try to tackle themselves.
How much time do you all spend personally combating misinformation?
We do it so much that we end up having an actual segment combating misinformation in the show.
Do you think that people who aren't Hispanohablantes, people who don't speak Spanish, understand the severity or the scale of this problem?
No, they don't. The English-speaking market has nothing to do with what is happening with the Spanish-speaking market.
Creating a political divide across the country that Amore and her mother say they hope to avoid at home.
So how does this work? I mean, what does the future look like if families can't agree on what is true and what is false?
We make coffee. And we talk
Una
about...
respuesta bien cubana.
Yeah.
A very Cuban answer.
We have to rely on God.